for this amazing session and to listen to these stories, which what I've heard are stories of dignity, human dignity and courage, and how we together face our very fragile future. So I think it's extraordinary what they've done, and we're really honored to be here.
Yes, and thank you indeed to the organizers of the SHE conference. We are honored to be here and to share our story with you.
I have some questions that I'm going to ask Nelson. This is just going to proceed as a conversation between us, but just before we came on, a young videographer stopped Nelson outside and said, "I have one question for you." What did he ask?
And thank you for that question. And my answer...
What was the question?
The question was, what makes you brave? Well, typically as a Maasai, I would say facing the lion. But actually, what I answered him is that what makes me brave is to be able to fight for the rights of the Maasai people in social justice and to advocate for the rights of indigenous people anywhere else in the world.
It's great. It's amazing. And that's really... I think that's the essence of the story that we're going to try to unfold in the very limited time that we've got. I'll just give you the story in a nutshell. We started something small, it turned into a very large movement. And it's a story of extraordinary possibility. Where the story is set is in the Masai Mara in Kenya in East Africa. Has anybody here been to the Masai Mara? Lots. Has anybody ever dreamed of going to the Masai Mara, maybe for safari? And how many people don't know what or where what I'm talking about is? Okay, it's in East Africa. And it's the homeland of the Maasai people. Nelson is a Maasai man. I'm going to start our story, Nelson, in the middle. The last time that you and I were in front of as many people as this was about a year and a half ago. And it was quite a special gathering. Do you want to tell something about that?
So we all remember about the COVID pandemic. Actually, we're just emerging out of that situation. So our community was facing starvation because after the closure of all travel to Kenya and the closure of all the markets where the community would normally barter, the community was staring starvation in the face. But our small conservancy came together and organized a feeding program that ended up being the lifesaver, feeding 28,000 people weekly for 1 year. So it was a momentous occasion when the community rose up and cared for itself.
And I just want to spend a couple of minutes unpacking that story because I think there's so much in it. It was a small community. We're going to go back to how it was formed. But Nelson, while there are many other established players in that part of the world, not only government, but outsiders who run large conservancies, large international NGOs, when the population was facing this very severe food security crisis, nobody else rose up to help. Is that right?
Yeah, that's quite right. In fact, most of the established players went back home. And while before they have been reaping on the benefits in the tourism sector, when it mattered most, no one was there. So the community had to stand up and took care of itself.
And I was lucky enough to be at that gathering, about 4,000 Maasai. Nelson said this is a historic gathering of Maasai people. And while it was a celebration to give thanks to the community of Nashulai, that is the conservancy that Nelson and I are co-founders of, watching that celebration, I said to Nelson, this is more than a celebration of gratitude, it's an expression of solidarity, because I think it became very clear that the only way to look after community is with community. And there's something extraordinary about Maasai people. I'm honored to be an adopted Maasai man, but there's something extraordinary about Maasai people because this community of what we're talking about at first, about 3,500 people, very poor, and facing this starvation crisis with very limited rations of food that we were distributing. But other people from beyond the Conservancy came to Nashulai because they heard that food was being given out. And what did the people in our community do?
Yeah, so traditionally, our community believes in looking after one another. So we cannot eat alone while our neighbors were staring starvation. So we shared the few rations that we had. So that was a community that was looking after itself, after one another, spreading the warmth from heart to heart.
See the time, we're going to have to hurry this story up. Okay, that's the middle of the story. Let's go right back to the very beginning. What is Nashulai? Why was it created? And what does it mean?
So Nashulai is a conservancy bordering the Masai Mara National Reserve in Kenya. The community came together to create a possibility for an ecosystem to be able to thrive again. An ecosystem that was threatened because of outsider interest. We saw land commodification, fences were erected, blocking the wildlife migratory corridors. And the community said, look, we need to do something. Otherwise, we'll lose this land forever. And this land was borrowed from our children. So unless we come together and did something to save this land, we will lose it in our time. So that is how we came together and created a different conservancy. Usually in the Masai Mara, the conservancies are created to preserve wildlife for the tourists to come and see. But we wanted to create a conservancy that will bring people, wildlife, and the culture of the Maasai together. So we did not create conservancy refugees in the name of creating the romanticized African landscape of the 1920s. So that was the story of a community coming together.
And in fact, I think you can see up on the screen this picture of man. He's actually the man who gave me my name when I was adopted as a Maasai elder. And the landscape of Nashulai, you can see the elephants behind, and the very meaning of the word Nashulai. It's a very special name in the Maasai language, and it means a place of harmony where community and wildlife can coexist. And the essence of the model of Nashulai is we coexist. People living in balance and reciprocal benefit with their livestock herds and with wildlife. It actually sounds like a miracle, except that that's how indigenous people like the Maasai have lived forever, until recently when they have been moved off their land. And this is where this issue of indigenous rights, indigenous participation, and the very ideas of this conference, which are about inclusivity, matters so very much. Because what is radically, defiantly different about the Nashulai model is that people remain on their ancestral lands rather than being displaced from their ancestral lands. Okay, that's the big picture. That's how the community formed Nashulai. Here's the extraordinary thing. It worked. Just explain what happened in a very short time.
Indeed, as soon as the conservancy was created, we saw a tremendous change in the biodiversity. We saw a return of the wildlife. I actually normally say that wildlife fought with its feet. Elephants rediscovered their birthing nurseries, where they've always given birth to their babies. The Great Migration, which gives life to the savanna of the East African ecosystems, once again moving freely. And in 2020, we, a small community, won the Equator Prize for standing together for their land. And actually, I just want to say that the future of global biodiversities rests in the hands of indigenous people, whether they're in East Africa or even in Norway, Sweden, where we have the Sami people.
It's true, and we do, because time is racing by, but in a very short time, Nashulai got global recognition from this UN Equator Prize, and then almost tripled in size. But now, because so many people have rallied, local people have rallied to this idea of coexistence and saving our fragile ecosystems, now, Nelson, just you can point about the wildlife corridor.
Yeah, and now as we speak, for a small conservancy that really began, when there was no possibility, people laughed at us, then they ignored us, then they fought us, and then we won. Now we are creating the longest wildlife corridor in East Africa that stretches from the Masai Mara, for those who may know where it is, all the way to the White Mountains of the Kilimanjaro. So that is a conservation corridor that is run on the ethos of Nashulai, whose mission is to conserve wildlife, preserve culture, and reverse poverty.
And then Nelson was asked, last summer to come to the United Nations in Nairobi and address all of the delegates for the Convention on Biodiversity who gathered there from around the world to tell the Nashulai story of possibility. So this story of indigenous people as guardians of vanishing ecosystems upon which all of our futures depend, these are not distant places, and this is not just a question about social justice. 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity is on indigenous lands. Scientists understand that indigenous inclusion and indigenous stewardship on those lands is crucial, and Nelson's story of Nashulai as a story of possibility rallied those delegates. And now, our little conservancy, 5,000 acres just to start, created by this local community, now globally recognized, speaking in front of the United Nations, is also assembling a carbon project. Nelson has been talking to Maasai leaders from how much area, Nelson?
2 million acres. And we're just so proud, not only to be safeguarding the natural ecosystems, but we're also promoting human rights, especially in the fight against injustice towards women. And my wife, who is actually somewhere here, is one of the leading advocates of the injustice against women in our community, a practice called female genital mutilation that affects 80% of women in our community. But I'm happy to report that ever since we came together as a community, this practice has gone down by 40%. And thanks to Margaret for that.
And now finally, to say goodbye and welcome, we are proud to be launching right here now a new enterprise called Nashulai Journeys, whose mission is travel to ancestral lands. So tourism is one of the biggest industries in the world. Tourism can hurt or it can help. And when there is travel to places where people are living on ancestral lands, caring for those lands, and caring for the cultures that are necessary for the preservation of those lands, Nashulai Journeys will be part of the solution in travel, not part of the problem. And Nelson, just in parting, perhaps you could say what this picture is.
Yeah, so what you are seeing are giraffes under the shadows of the Mountain of God, where the Maasai believe that their ceremonies begins at. So in fact, we invite you to visit the ancestral lands. We invite you to visit Nashulai. And thank you so much for listening to us.
And at the Mountain of God, this most spiritual of sites for Maasai people, there is now an outpost, another Nashulai conservancy, because the local community of Maasai people there said that they wanted to create Nashulai, again in defiance of the other conservation model, which in places like Tanzania forces people from their ancestral lands at the point of a gun. Ancestral people, indigenous people, are the guardians of vanishing ecosystems. The possibilities for our shared future actually rest in very large part on their brave shoulders. Thank you all very much. And now, back to Shruti.